Arizona, 1,883. A root cellar 6 feet underground. Dead of night. The kerosene lamp is almost gone. The air is thick with whiskey, blood, and heat that has nowhere to go. Tess looks straight up into the eyes of a man built like a canyon wall, her hands trembling, her gaze absolutely not. She grips what's left of her torn dress and lifts it. I feel a heat. She breathes, her voice raw in a way it has never been before in her life. The giant goes completely still. Those huge, calloused hands brace her hips, holding on and holding back at the same time. Tess. His voice comes out rough. Are you sure this is your body, your choice? She doesn't answer with words. She pulls him into a kiss. How did a proper girl from Philadelphia end up here, buried underground, hunted, and completely unafraid? The whole story starts now. The stagecoach hit the last rut, hard enough to rattle Tess Montgomery's teeth. She grabbed the leather strap above the window and held on, watching the desert blur past in shades of rust and bone. Arizona. Nothing like she'd imagined. Nothing like the paintings in her mother's parlor back in Philadelphia. All soft greens and gentle slopes. Out here, the land looked like it had been through a war and lost. The driver hollered something up top. The wheels locked. The whole carriage groaned to a stop in a cloud of brown dust that immediately found its way through every gap in the door. Tess coughed into her glove. She was the only passenger left. Had been since Tucson. She smoothed her navy wool skirt out of habit, even though it was hopeless. The dress had been a practical choice back home. Out here, under this sun, it was a slow suffocation. The wool held heat the way a furnace held coals. Sweat had soaked through her corset hours ago. She pressed her face to the window. A cluster of low wooden buildings shimmered in the heat. A hand-painted sign above the largest one read, Dusted Creekest, 1,871. Population, she guessed, not many. The driver dropped her 2 trunks into the dirt without ceremony, and she climbed down after them, one careful hand on the iron step. The moment both feet hit the ground, the stagecoach lurched forward again. The driver didn't look back. She stood there in the open street and squinted. There was a saloon, a general store with a sagging porch, a livery stable, a few men loitering in doorways, watching her the way dogs watch a rabbit wander into a yard. Tess straightened her back and lifted her chin. She was here to meet Harlan Finch, her intended, the man whose letters had been courteous, whose photograph had shown a square jaw and steady eyes, whose correspondence had promised a modest ranch, a good life, and a husband who needed a capable woman at his side. She scanned the street. Nobody stepped forward to greet her. A woman sweeping the general store porch paused and stared at her. An old man on a bench across the way leaned over and spat into the dust. 2 miners in dirty canvas trousers had stopped their conversation entirely and were just watching. Tess walked to the saloon. It seemed like the only place anyone was actually conducting business. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and stale whiskey, and something underneath both of those things that she couldn't name and didn't want to. The barkeep was a wide man with a red face and small eyes. He looked at her, then at her trunks, then back at her. I'm looking for Harlan Finch, she said. I was told to meet him here. The barkeep's expression did something complicated. He set down the glass he was cleaning. Finch? He repeated, yes, Harlan Finch. He's a rancher. We have a marriage arrangement. The barkeep looked over her shoulder. She heard boots on the floorboards behind her. 2 men came in through the side door. One of them was wide as a doorframe with a leather apron and knuckles that had been broken and reset more than once. The other was lean and sharp-eyed, with a deputy's star pinned at an angle on his vest. You the mail-order bride? The barkeep asked. I am Tess Montgomery, yes. Harlan Finch is gone. He said it flat, like he was telling her the weather. Lit out 2 nights ago. Cleaned out the town's ammunition supply from the back of Dawson's store before he left. Took 4 cases. Left behind a gambling debt of $430. The air went out of the room. Tess kept her face still. She'd learned that in her mother's house. Keep still. Don't let them see it land." "That can't be correct," she said, though her voice came out quieter than she wanted it to. "It's correct." The big man in the leather apron stepped closer. He smelled like coal smoke and old beer, and the way we see it, you're the nearest thing to collateral that Finch left behind. "Collateral," she repeated. "You heard right." He crossed his arms. 3 more men had drifted in from the back room. The lean deputy hadn't moved, but he hadn't stepped forward either. "His debt is your debt, the way we figure it. Your trunk's there, whatever's in 'em. It's a start. You could work it off," another man offered from the side, and the way he said it made her stomach turn cold. Tess understood then, fully and completely, what was happening. She was 2,000 miles from home, in a town where nobody knew her name, with no husband, no escort, no plan. Her trunks held her mother's silver-handled hairbrush, 3 dresses, a Bible, and approximately $11 in coin. She thought about sitting down. Her legs wanted her to. She thought about crying. Her throat was tight enough for it. She did neither. She reached up and held the collar of her dress with one hand, not out of modesty, but because she needed something to grip. She looked at the barkeep, then at the big man in the apron, then slowly around at the rest of them. "You may take my luggage," she said, her voice clear and even, "but I am a human being, not a piece of property or a gold coin to be traded for a coward's debt." Nobody moved. "Harlan Finch made those debts. Harlan Finch took your ammunition. I have never set foot in this town before this afternoon, and I will not be made to answer for another person's crimes. That is not justice. That is not law. That is simply men taking what they can from someone who has less power than they do." The big man's jaw worked. "Lady, I have not finished." She surprised herself. The heat, maybe, or the exhaustion, or the fact that after 21 years of being told to sit quietly and take up as little space as possible, she had absolutely nothing left to lose. "If there is a sheriff in this town, I would like to speak with him. If there is a judge, I would like to speak with him instead. If there is neither, then I suggest you think very carefully about what you are proposing, because what you are describing is not debt collection. It has another name entirely. I believe most of you know what that name is. Silence." Then the man in the leather apron moved toward her anyway. She stepped back. Her heel caught the edge of one of her trunks, and she nearly went down. Someone grabbed her arm from the left one of the miners, and she wrenched away from him hard enough to feel it in her shoulder. They were closing in. 4 of them, maybe 5. The deputy had turned away. The barkeep had found somewhere else to look. Tess faced them and did not move. If this was how it ended, she would not make it easy. Then, from somewhere near the back wall, came the sound of boots. Slow, deliberate, with a faint metallic clink at each step. Not hurried, not loud, just utterly steady, like someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. The men near her stopped moving. She didn't know why, at first. Then she felt it, a shift in the room, a change in pressure, the way a room goes quiet when a storm is still just a sound on the horizon. She turned. There was a man standing in the shadows near the back door. He had not been there a moment ago, or maybe he had been there the whole time, and she simply hadn't seen him. He was enormous. That was the first word. Enormous. Tall enough that the low beam above the door would have caught him if he hadn't tilted his head slightly on the way through, wide through the shoulders in a way that made the door frame look modest. He wore a battered hat, a sun-darkened duster, and boots that had seen real work. He didn't have his hand on his gun. He hadn't said a word. He just looked at the room. The man in the leather apron took a half step back. The steel in those eyes wasn't anger. Exactly. It wasn't a threat. It was something colder and more permanent than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had seen exactly this before and had already decided how it was going to go. The giant cowboy stepped forward out of the shadows, and the boards creaked under his boots, and the whole room made room for him without being asked. Tess held very still. She had no idea who this man was. But for the first time since the stagecoach stopped, she felt something shift, not in her chest, not dramatically. Just something practical and quiet, like a door she hadn't known was locked suddenly, having a key nearby. She didn't let herself feel relieved yet. Out here, she was learning fast. You didn't know who the wolves were until after they'd already moved. Nobody in that saloon moved first. That was the thing about real stillness. It wasn't the absence of movement. It was the presence of something heavier than movement. Every man in the room had gone quiet, the way animals go quiet, before a change in weather. The only sounds were the tick of a wall clock and the slow, measured clink of spurs against floorboards, as the giant stepped fully into the light. He stopped about 10 feet from the group, crowded around Tess. His eyes moved across them. Not fast, not nervous. He looked at each man the way a rancher checks a fence line, methodical, unhurried, already making calculations. The man in the leather apron was the first to speak. Bear, he said it, the way people say a word they've practiced, not flinching at. This ain't your business. I'm making it mine, the giant said. His voice was low. Not loud at all. That was the part that surprised Tess. She had expected a shout, some kind of declaration. Instead, it came out quiet and flat, like something already decided. The apron man's jaw tightened. Finch left a debt. The woman's what he left behind. The woman has a name, and she came here on a contract that the other party broke. The giant still hadn't moved his hand toward his gun. He didn't seem to need to. She didn't steal your ammunition. She didn't run up your debt. She got off a stagecoach an hour ago in a town full of men who've already decided she's useful to them. Silence. That's not debt collection, he said. That's something else, and you all know it. The man to Tess's left the one who had grabbed her arm, shifted his weight, and looked at the floor. The lean deputy near the bar was studying a water stain on the ceiling with tremendous concentration. The apron man held for another moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. Finch still owes what he owes. Take it up with Finch. The giant looked at him steadily. You find him, another beat. The apron man looked around at his companions. None of them offered him anything useful. He shook his head once, disgusted, and walked back toward the rear of the bar. The others peeled away in ones and twos, not quickly, saving what face they could. The deputy found somewhere else to be. Tess stood very still among her trunks and watched the room empty. The giant walked toward her. He was even taller, up close. She had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him properly, and she was not a short woman. His face was weathered and hard-angled, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same rock the canyon walls were made of. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, thin and old. His eyes were dark brown, almost black in the low light. He looked her over once, not invasively more, the way someone checks a person for injury after a fall. You all right? He said. Yes, she said, though her legs had started trembling slightly, and she hoped it didn't show. He reached down and picked up both her trunks, one in each hand, as if they weighed nothing particular. Come on, he said. She didn't move immediately. Where are we going? My horse is out front. He looked back at her. You can stay here if you'd rather. She looked around at the empty saloon. The barkeep had his back to her, wiping glasses. Somewhere in the back, she could hear the apron man's voice, low and unhappy. She followed the giant out the door. His horse was a big gray quarter horse, broad through the chest, tied to the post out front. It looked at her with calm, dark eyes. The giant loaded her trunks across the back with practiced efficiency, lashing them with rope. He pulled from a saddlebag. Tess stood beside the horse and watched him work. Her heart was still moving too fast. The heat outside was enormous, pressing down from directly above. She could feel the wool of her dress pulling the heat inward and holding it. I need to ask you something, she said. He kept working the rope. Go ahead. What do you expect in return? She held her voice level. It was a practical question. She had learned in the last hour to ask practical questions immediately. For stepping in, for taking me wherever you're taking me. There's always a price. I'd rather know it now than find out later. He finished the knot and straightened up to his full height. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't read, not offense, not amusement, something more like recognition. "I saved you," he said, "because I don't stand by and watch cowards corner someone without a gun." He paused. "Out here, respect and human dignity are the only things separating us from wild wolves. You owe me nothing." Tess had been prepared for a price. She had mentally inventoried what she had left $11. The silver hairbrush skills that were largely decorative by this territory's standards. She had been ready to negotiate. She had not been prepared for nothing. She didn't know what to do with nothing. He put out his hand to help her mount. She took it, put her boot in the stirrup, and settled onto the horse behind the saddle on the space he'd left her. He swung up in front of her in one easy motion and clicked his tongue at the gray. They moved out of Dusted Creek at a walk, and nobody came after them. She didn't ask where they were going again. The horse moved steadily north, toward a ridge of red rock that rose up in the distance like something ancient had been interrupted mid-collapse and left standing. The sun was starting its downward arc. Out in the desert, shadows stretched long and purple from the base of every cactus. After a while, she said, "I'm Tess Montgomery." "I know," he said. "Word got around when they were expecting Finch's bride, and they called you Bear." "Wyatt Coulter," he said. "Bear's what people around here call me." She could understand why. She sat behind him on the horse and watched the red canyon grow larger as they rode toward it, and she thought about what he'd said. Respect and human dignity. He had said it out in the open, in front of those men, without embarrassment or self-consciousness, like it was just a plain fact about how the world should work. She had grown up in a house where those words were said in church on Sundays, and then quietly set aside for the rest of the week. She filed the contradiction away and said nothing more. By the time the canyon walls rose up on either side of them, the sky had turned from white-hot blue to something softer, and the air, remarkably, had cooled by 10 degrees. The horse picked its way along a trail that Tess couldn't have found on her own in 100 years. Ahead, set back against the canyon wall, she could see a ranch house, a barn, a water trough fed by a narrow stream, a vegetable garden fenced against rabbits. It was small, but it was solid. Someone had built it to last. Wyatt Coulter brought the horse to a stop and dismounted, then helped her down. He showed her inside, a main room with a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves with supplies arranged with plain efficiency, a separate room with a bed and a dresser. He set her trunks just inside the door of the bedroom. "You take this room," he said. "I'll be in the bunkhouse." "The bunkhouse," she repeated. He pulled the door open and nodded toward a small outbuilding 50 feet away. "Got a cot and a stove. I've slept there before." She looked at him. He was already turning to leave. "Mr. Coulter." He stopped. She didn't know what she wanted to say. Exactly. Thank you felt insufficient, and also somehow beside the point. She settled for, "I intend to earn my keep while I'm here. Whatever work there is." He looked back at her with those dark, still eyes. "All right," he said simply. And then he walked out toward the bunkhouse, and she stood in the doorway of the bedroom, with her trunks at her feet, and the last light of the Arizona sun coming through the single window in a long orange stripe. And she thought, "I am alive. I am still standing. That will have to be enough for tonight." She sat down on the edge of the bed, put her face in her hands, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of being frightened. Then she unpacked. Morning came hard in the canyon. The light hit the red rock walls first and bounced back in, warm and indirect, so the sky was already bright before the sun actually cleared the ridge. Tess was awake before it did. She hadn't slept much. The silence out here was a different kind of silence than Philadelphia. No street noise, no carriages, no voices from the neighbors through the wall. Just wind and occasional distant birdsong, and once in the night, a coyote somewhere far off in the desert, calling it nothing. She dressed and came out of the house to find Wyatt already at the corral. He was working with a young roan horse, running it in circles on a long rope, reading its movements with patient attention. His hat was low against the early glare. He didn't look up when she came out, but he said, "Coffee's on the stove." She went back inside, poured herself a cup, and stood in the doorway drinking it, watching him work. He had a gentleness with the horse that she hadn't expected. Not softness, there was nothing soft about him, but patience. He let the horse set the pace of its own calming. He didn't force it. When the roan finally slowed and came toward him, with its head low, he put a hand flat on its neck and stood there for a moment, quiet. Tess finished her coffee. After breakfast, which she cooked, because she could do that, at minimum, he took her out to the post and beam fence at the far edge of the property. "You said you wanted to earn your keep," he said. "I did. Then the first thing you need is a way to protect yourself that doesn't depend on someone else being present." He had a Colt .45 in his hand. He held it out to her grip first. She looked at it. She had never touched a firearm in her life. Her mother had considered them unspeakable, roughly in the same category as public argument and the color red after 40. She took it. It was heavier than she'd imagined. The grip was smooth from years of use. She held it with both hands automatically, which seemed to be correct, because Wyatt didn't correct her. "First thing," he said, "is that you keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot."
Not mostly
Ready. Ready, he showed her where her finger should rest along the frame. She adjusted. "Second thing," pointed at the fence post there, the one with the red paint. "Don't think about the gun. Think about the post." She pointed it at the post. "Now squeeze, don't pull. There's a difference. Pulling jerks your aim. Squeezing keeps it steady." She squeezed. The gun fired with a crack that shocked her, despite the warning, the recoil jumping up her arms. She hadn't hit the post. She'd hit somewhere to the left of it, in the wood of the fence rail. But she'd kept her feet, and she hadn't dropped the gun. "Good," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "I missed. You didn't flinch. That's harder." He loaded another round. Most people flinch the first time. Some people flinch every time. A gun is only useful if you can control yourself while you're holding it. She fired again. Closer. The third shot clipped the edge of the post. By mid-morning, she had put 4 rounds in the post itself. He was not effusive with praise. He said things like "better," and again, and once, when she adjusted her stance on her own without being told, he said, "There you go," in a way that was brief but felt like something more. He taught her to ride astride that afternoon. This was, by Philadelphia standards, scandalous. Ladies rode side saddle. It was a matter of modesty and decorum and propriety and approximately 40 other words that all meant the same thing. Women should be decorative and inefficient and dependent on assistance to dismount. Wyatt showed her the stirrups, showed her the seat, and said, "Astrid gives you control. Side saddle gives a fall." She appreciated that he framed it as practical rather than radical. She swung her leg over the gray horse, his horse, since she had none, and found the stirrups, and they went around the corral until she had the rhythm of it. He kept a deliberate distance while he worked with her. She noticed it. 5 paces, roughly. He never came closer unless she asked him a direct question, and then he'd step in to demonstrate and step back again after. It wasn't cold. It was considered. There was a difference between those two things, too. She was finding. On the second evening, she was carrying water up from the stream when she came around the corner of the bunkhouse and stopped. Wyatt was washing at the pump beside the bunkhouse wall, shirt off, his back to her. She should have turned around. She knew that. Instead, for just a moment, she stood. His back was scarred. Not 1 or 2 marks. Many. Thin old lines that crossed and recrossed in patterns that could only have come from a whip, applied repeatedly over time. The scars had faded to silver white, old enough to be years behind him, but there were enough of them that they told a story without words. Someone, at some point in Wyatt Coulter's past, had done that to him, deliberately and repeatedly. She stepped back before he heard her and took the long way back to the house. She thought about it while she cooked. She thought about what it meant that a man who had been marked like that had grown up to be someone who stepped between cowards and someone without a gun. She thought about how a person could carry something that heavy and still move with that kind of steadiness. She didn't bring it up. It wasn't her place to. Not yet, maybe not ever. But it changed something in how she looked at him. He wasn't just a wall she was standing behind. He was a person who knew something about enduring. 3 days into her time at the ranch, she went through Harlan Finch's letters again. She had kept them. She was not sure why, some instinct about documentation, perhaps, or maybe just that she'd had them for months and didn't know how to throw away something that had represented her future. She spread them on the kitchen table in the afternoon light and read them more carefully than she had before. The third letter mentioned a partner he was working with on a land deal. He didn't name the man. He called him a fellow of considerable enterprise and substantial connections, and said the deal would make them both comfortable. The sixth letter talked about shipments. She had assumed he meant cattle or grain. Reading it now, with different eyes, the language was careful, in a way that seemed deliberate. The goods will pass through the county at the end of the month. My associate has arranged timing with the relevant parties. She sat back. She was not a fool. She had read enough newspapers and seen enough of the world, limited as her world had been, to recognize when language was being used to avoid saying something plainly. What passed through a county at the end of a month, on a schedule specific enough to arrange timing around, and required an associate with connections. Gold shipments. The county ran them quarterly. She had heard someone at the saloon mention it in passing. Payroll for the mines, army contracts, a substantial sum. She put the letters together and held them in her hands. If she was right, Harlan Finch had not simply fled a gambling debt and abandoned her out of cowardice. He had used his correspondence with her as cover, a reason to be in the territory, reason to receive and send letters, a reason to have access to information about local schedules and routes. He had been planning something before she ever set foot on the stagecoach, and somewhere out in the desert with whatever he had stolen from Dusted Creek, he was still planning it. She heard Wyatt's boots on the porch steps. He came through the door, looked at her at the table, looked at the letters. He read people efficiently. She was learning. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being asked. "Tell me," he said. So she did. She laid it out straight, everything she'd read, every odd phrase, every careful omission. She didn't dress it up or apologize for the conclusion she'd come to. She just put it out there, plain, the way he had taught her to aim at the fence post, no flinching, straight at the target. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letters. He looked at her. "You're probably right," he said. "I know." She folded the letters. "So what do we do about it?" He leaned back in the chair, which creaked under his weight, and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "First thing," he said, "is that we need to figure out who else Finch is working with, because robbing a county gold shipment isn't a two-man operation." He brought his eyes back to her. "And second thing, yes? You just tripled how dangerous your situation is," he said. "Not harshly. Just plainly, you know something now, which means if Finch figures out you know it, or figures out those letters didn't burn up with the rest of his tracks." "He'll come back," she said. "He'll come back." She looked at the letters in her hand. Outside, the canyon wind moved through the scrub brush, and the shadows were getting long, and somewhere out past the Red Ridge, Harlan Finch was working towards something that involved a significant amount of other people's money and an apparently unlimited amount of disregard for anyone who got in the way. She thought about 5 minutes of fear, a policy she had adopted on her first night. She thought about a man's scarred back and how he moved through the world anyway. She set the letters on the table, flat. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. Wyatt looked at her across the table, and she couldn't be certain, but she thought something in his expression shifted very slightly, very briefly, towards something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Yeah," he said. "We'd better." The sheriff arrived on a Thursday. Tess was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the bean rows, when she heard the horse come down the canyon trail. She stood up and shielded her eyes. One rider. A badge caught the light. Wyatt came out of the barn a moment later. He had heard it too. The sheriff was a lean man in his 50s named Aldous Cray, with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades looking into the Arizona sun. He dismounted at the fence, tied his horse, and walked toward them with his hat in his hand, which Tess took as a reasonable sign. "Coulter," he said. Then, to Tess, "Miss Montgomery." "Sheriff," Wyatt said. Cray looked uncomfortable. He turned his hat slowly in his hands, a nervous habit he probably didn't know he had. "I'm going to give it to you straight," he said. "There's talk in town." "There's always talk in town," Wyatt said. "This kind's got teeth." Cray looked at Tess. "Finch has been sending word back. Got a man in Tucson who's been putting letters around. The letters say Miss Montgomery is being held here against her will. Say you rode in and took her off before she could find proper shelter." He paused. "The story's been growing. You know how stories grow." Tess felt the cold logic of it immediately. Finch, somewhere out in the desert with stolen ammunition and a plan involving the county gold shipment, was managing his loose ends. She was a loose end. If he could get a mob to remove her from Wyatt's protection without Finch having to show his face, so much the better. "That's calculated," she said aloud. Both men looked at her. "He knows that if he comes back to this county himself, he'll be arrested. So he's using other people to do what he needs done. He manufactures a story. People who don't know any better get angry on what they think is principle, and he gets the result without the risk." She pulled off her gardening gloves. "It's actually fairly intelligent." For a coward, Cray looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said nothing, but something in his expression agreed with her. "Regardless of how it started," Cray said, "I've got 4 families in town who are talking about riding out here. Couple of the miners from the saloon stirring it up. They're saying, if you won't bring her in voluntarily, they'll come and get her and burn the ranch on principle." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I can't stop a mob, Coulter. I got one deputy, and he's about as useful as a screen door." Tess thought about Finch's letters, still sitting in the kitchen. She thought about the gold shipment. She thought about what happened to women who ended up in the custody of angry mobs operating on manufactured outrage. "What would help?" she asked Cray directly. He looked at her with something close to relief, as if he'd expected to have to negotiate harder to get to the practical part. "Legally, if there was a marriage on record, the question of your status becomes a private matter between husband and wife. Nobody's got legal standing to remove a woman from her own home and her husband's property." He paused. "It's not a perfect answer." "No," she said, "it's not." She turned and walked inside. Wyatt found her at the kitchen table a few minutes later, sitting with her hands flat on the wood, thinking. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. The sheriff had waited outside with the horses. Wyatt said nothing for a moment. He let her think. That was something she had noticed about him. He didn't fill silence with noise just to fill it. "You don't have to," he said finally. "I know. If there's another way to handle it." "There isn't," she said. "Not in time. Not with a mob that could ride out here in 2 days." She looked at him. "A legal marriage would protect me. A paper marriage. It doesn't have to be anything beyond that." He met her eyes. "It wouldn't be, unless you wanted it to be." "I'd want certain things in writing," she said. He nodded. "Whatever you need." She looked at him carefully. She had been in his house for over a week. She had eaten his food and learned to shoot his guns and ridden his horse and slept under his roof. She had watched him work in the corral with patience that most men in her experience didn't bother extending to animals, let alone people. She had read his back like a map of someone else's cruelty. He had kept 5 paces of distance every single day. She didn't trust easily. She had been raised not to, and recent events had done nothing to soften that instinct. But she trusted facts, and the facts in front of her were plain. "All right," she said, "but I want a formal agreement. Written out, signed, witnessed. I'll get paper." He got paper. They wrote it out together at the kitchen table, Tess drafting the language, and Wyatt reading it carefully and suggesting one change to the property clause that was actually more favorable to her than her original draft. She redrafted it, and they read it together. It stated that Tess Montgomery retained full personal autonomy. It stated that she had the right to leave the arrangement at any time of her choosing with no financial penalty. It stated that Wyatt Coulter would transfer full legal ownership of the east half of the ranch land to Tess Montgomery upon signing, to be held in her name outright. Not in trust, not conditional. She looked up when she read that last part. This is half your ranch. Property's only useful if it's actually owned, he said. A woman who has land can make decisions. A woman who's dependent on someone else's goodwill is just hoping. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the paper. They sent for the preacher that afternoon. Preacher Hollis was a round, cheerful man from the Methodist church in town, who asked no uncomfortable questions and seemed quietly pleased to be involved in something that was at least partially unusual. Sheriff Cray signed as witness. The preacher said the words. Wyatt and Tess said what was required. Before he signed the final document, Wyatt looked at Tess and said what he'd written in the agreement out loud. He said it in front of the preacher and the sheriff both. The worst prison on earth is coercion, he said. I will never cross the threshold of your room unless you open that door yourself. Preacher Hollis blinked. Sheriff Cray cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling. Tess held Wyatt's gaze and saw no performance in it. He wasn't saying it for the audience. He was saying it because he'd written it, and he meant what he wrote. I know, she said quietly. They signed. After the sheriff and the preacher rode out, Tess stood in the yard in the long afternoon light and looked at the canyon walls. Half this land was hers now. The bean garden she'd been weeding was hers. The water rights from the stream ran with the land. She had arrived in Arizona a week ago with $11 and a silver hairbrush and no husband and a room full of men who wanted to use her as currency. She was not sure what she was now, exactly, but she was certain she had more ground under her feet than she'd had 7 days ago. Literally and otherwise. Wyatt came and stood beside her. Not too close. His customary distance. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me for giving you something you should have had by default, he said. She thought about that for the rest of the evening. In the days that followed, the mob talk died out. Cray let it be known around town that Miss Tess Montgomery was Mrs. Tess Coulter now, and had been so of her own free choice with a preacher and a sheriff present, and that anyone who rode out to Red Rock Canyon on Harlan Finch's manufactured story was going to have a conversation with county law on the way back. The miners lost interest. Most people, it turned out, were not deeply committed to causes that required actual effort. Tess and Wyatt worked the ranch. She got better with the colt. She got easier on the gray horse, who was named Milton, which she found endearing. She fixed a section of fence on the east property line that had been sagging for what looked like a season. Wyatt repaired the barn roof and didn't comment when she climbed up and handed him shingles from the ladder. In the evenings, they sometimes sat on the porch and watched the canyon go dark. The sky out here, at night, was something she had no reference for. The stars in Philadelphia were suggestions, pale things glimpsed between buildings. Out here, they were overwhelming, the whole dome of the sky, thick with light, pressing down. She thought about the gold shipment. She thought about Finch's letters and his unnamed associate, and the careful language about timing and goods passing through the county. She was keeping track. She had a small notebook now, from Wyatt's supplies, and she wrote down everything she remembered from the letters and everything she had observed or heard since arriving. It was something to do with her worry. Besides, let it sit. Wyatt, for his part, had been quietly asking questions in town on his supply runs. He came back one evening and sat down across from her at the table with the look of a man who has learned something he'd rather not have confirmed. Finch has been seen, he said, south of the county line, with at least 6 men. She stopped writing. 6 armed. He paused. The shipment goes through in 12 days. She looked at her notebook. 12 days was not much time. Then we need a plan, she said. He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind was picking up through the canyon, and somewhere in the distance, the first of the evening's coyotes started calling, and the night settled in around Red Rock Ridge like it was getting ready for something. The sky turned yellow on a Tuesday. Tess noticed it first from the garden, a particular yellow, almost greenish at the horizon, the color of old brass. The air had gone preternaturally still. Even the birds had stopped. She stood up from the bean rows and looked south. The wall was visible from 30 miles out, a solid mass of dark red, rising from the desert floor to the clouds, moving north with the deliberate patience of something that had never needed to hurry. She had read about hayboobs in a geography pamphlet. On the stagecoach, the pamphlet had described them in 3 sentences and a small illustration. The illustration had not adequately conveyed the scale. Wyatt. She walked fast toward the barn. Wyatt, there I see it. He was already coming out of the barn, looking south. He assessed it for about 2 seconds. Get inside. Close every window. Put wet rags along the door bottoms. Get the lamps in from the porch. The animals, I'll get them in. Go, she went. She pulled the lamps in, unhooked the shutters, and latched them, soaked rags at the kitchen water basin, and pressed them along the base of every door. The light outside had shifted from yellow to a deep bruised orange. The wind was starting now, not a gust, but a sustained pressure, like something pushing against the walls with its whole weight. She could hear Wyatt moving the horses into the barn, the stamp of hooves, his voice low and steady with the animals. Then she heard something else. It was under the wind noise. Barely. But she had been practicing listening. Out here, Wyatt had told her once that the desert was loud if you knew how to hear it, and she had been working at it. 3 weeks of working at it. Horses, more than one, coming from the south, from the direction of the storm. She moved to the window and unlatched the shutter, just a fraction, peering through the gap. The air outside was already thick with dust, red-tinged, the visibility dropping by the minute, but she could make out shapes. Riders, coming fast, using the cover of the building storm the way hunters use long grass. She counted. 5, 6. Her hand found the Colt on the kitchen shelf without her consciously deciding to reach for it. She had it loaded, and in her hand by the time Wyatt came back through the door. He took one look at her face, then looked toward the window. How many? He said. 6 that I saw. He moved immediately. He crossed to the cabinet and pulled out the rifle, checked it, moved to the side window. His face was entirely calm, which somehow made her calmer too. Not because it meant there was nothing to worry about, but because panic was clearly not on his list of available responses. They'll come to the barn first, he said. Try to cut off our horses, then the house. He looked at her. Can you hold the back door? Yes. Anyone comes through it, that isn't me. You don't wait, I understand. He looked at her for one moment. Whatever he saw in her face seemed to satisfy him. He moved to the front of the house. The storm hit the ranch like a wave hitting a rock. The sound was extraordinary, a roaring hiss that swallowed every other sound, grit hammering the wooden walls, the shutters straining against their latches. The light through the gaps went the color of dried blood. Tess moved to the back door and positioned herself to the left of it, her back against the wall, the Colt up, the way Wyatt had drilled her. She breathed, slowly. She focused on the door and not on the sounds of the storm around her. The front of the house erupted in gunfire. She flinched at the first crack, but stayed where she was. She heard Wyatt's rifle return fire. She heard shouting outside, voices she didn't recognize, swallowed partly by the storm noise. The back door rattled. Then it came in hard. The man through the door was big and fast, and he came through low, which told her he'd done this before. She fired once. The shot took him in the shoulder, and he spun and went down and didn't get up. She stepped over him and to the side, cleared the doorframe, looked out into the swirling red dark. Another shape, hesitating at the edge of the garden fence. She fired in that direction, and the shape dropped back and didn't come forward. She pulled the back door shut as far as it would go with a broken frame. More gunfire from the front, the rifle. Then a pause. Then pistol shots, different caliber, different rhythm. She didn't know whose. She moved through the house toward the front. Wyatt was at the window, blood on his left forearm, working the rifle with controlled efficiency. 3 men were visible through the window, using the water trough and the fence as cover in the red, howling air. "Your arm," she said. "Scratch," he said, and fired. One of the men by the fence went down. Then the storm did something she hadn't expected. It surged. A fresh wall of it, a second mass following the first, hit the ranch with enough force that the front window shutter tore free and slammed against the wall. The whole room filled with red dust in seconds, choking, blinding. Through it she heard Wyatt shout, not in pain, a warning, and then a crack of wood from the far side of the barn, and then a shot from somewhere close that had no business being that close. The back of the barn. Behind them. Finch. She spun, but she was a half-second too slow to see it happen. She heard the shot and heard Wyatt hit the wall, and then the floor. She was at his side before she was aware of moving. He had gone down against the base of the wall. His hand was pressed to his right side. Blood was coming through his fingers. Dark and immediate. His face was tight, but his eyes were open. "How bad?" she said. "Bad enough," he said. "I can still move." "Then move now." She got her shoulder under his arm. He was 100 pounds heavier than her, and the world's most inconvenient piece of architecture to try to relocate. But she got him upright and moving. Outside, the storm was a complete wall of red, and through it she could hear Finch's men pulling back. The storm was too much even for them, swallowing everything. She got Wyatt to the root cellar door in the floor of the kitchen. He got it open himself with his free hand, and they went down the steps, and he pulled it shut above them. 6 feet underground, the roaring of the storm became a low, massive vibration in the earth itself, felt more than heard. Tess found the kerosene lamp on the shelf by feel, found the matches, got it lit on the 3rd try. The small flame steadied and threw amber light across the cramped space shelves of canned goods, hanging bundles of dried herbs, a barrel of salted meat, a low ceiling that even Tess had to tilt her head under. Wyatt was sitting against the far wall, with his hand still pressed to his side. She went to him. She didn't ask permission or announce what she was doing. She pulled his hand gently away and looked at the wound. The bullet had gone in on the right side below the ribs. She couldn't tell how deep. The bleeding was heavy, but not arterial. She knew what that looked like from her mother's medical pamphlets, the ones she'd read secretly in the library. She needed to clean it and pack it, and she needed to do it now. She had 2 things available. The whiskey from the shelf, half a bottle, enough, and fabric. She looked at her dress, heavy navy wool layered, practically a separate building she wore to work in. She started tearing the underskirt. Wyatt watched her. "You don't have to." "I'm aware of that," she said, and kept tearing. She poured whiskey directly into the wound. He made a sound through his teeth, and his hand gripped the floor planking, but he didn't move away. She packed the wound with clean cloth, pressed hard, held pressure. Above them, something heavy hit the cellar door. She looked up. Stone, from the sound of it. Part of the house foundation shifted by the storm, or a collapsed corner of something. She pushed on the door with her free hand. It didn't move. Wyatt tried with his. Together, with 1 arm each, they couldn't shift it. She looked at him. He looked at the door. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. She kept pressure on the wound. The lamp flame wavered in some small draft from between the floorboards above. The storm roared on, endless and total, and the root cellar held, and they were alone in the amber dark with the smell of whiskey and old herbs and blood, and somewhere above the stone and the earth and the storm, the night was coming down over Red Rock Ridge. Wyatt's head tilted back against the wall. His breathing was labored. His eyes closed. "Wyatt," she said it sharp. His eyes opened. "Still here. Stay here," she said. "I need you to stay awake." He looked at her, pale now under the tan. the lines around his eyes deeper with pain. But he held her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and the faintest edge of something wry in his voice, considering the sealed door above them, made her almost want to laugh, despite everything. She kept her hands on the wound and held the pressure, and watched his face in the lamplight, and the storm went on above them, and the world outside ceased to exist entirely. The storm took its time dying. Tess could feel it through the earth, that deep vibration, the weight of moving air translated into something almost geological. It wasn't loud down here so much as constant. A pressure that didn't let up. She had moved from kneeling to sitting after the first hour, her back against the wall beside Wyatt, her hands still maintaining pressure on the wound through the packed cloth. Her arms ached. She didn't stop. The lamp threw a small, warm circle. Everything outside that circle was dark and close, the shelves pressing in, the ceiling low enough that she could feel it without looking up. The root cellar had been built for storing food through summer heat, not for habitation. It was maybe 8 feet long and 5 feet wide. The smell was whiskey and dried herbs and blood and the particular mineral sharpness of undisturbed earth. Wyatt had drifted twice. Each time she said his name and he came back. She learned to read his breathing. When it slowed too far, she said anything, a question, a comment about the canned goods on the shelf, once the entire text of a poem her mother had made her memorize at age 9. He responded each time. Short answers, sometimes just a sound, but enough. An hour into it, she decided she needed to look at the wound again properly. The first packing had been emergency work, fast and necessary. She pulled the cloth back carefully and held the lamp close. The bleeding had slowed significantly. That was good. The wound itself was ragged at the edges. A bullet wound was not a clean thing, but she could see now that it had not gone deep toward the center of him. It had caught the flesh at the side, below the ribs, muscle and tissue, but not the organs underneath. She had no medical training. But she had read everything her mother owned, including the books her mother kept on the high shelf that weren't meant for her, including a surgery manual from her father's collection that she'd gotten through twice before her mother noticed. She knew what a wound that hit the gut looked like in its aftermath. This wasn't that. She exhaled. "You're going to be all right," she said. She said it matter-of-factly, not the way someone says it to comfort a person, but the way someone says it when they have assessed the available evidence and reached a conclusion. Wyatt opened his eyes. He had been in and out for a while. "You sound sure." "I am," she said. The bullet went wide. "You're losing blood, but not fast enough to be in serious danger right now. The whiskey will keep infection from starting if we're lucky, and we need to keep pressure on it for at least another hour." She paused. "You'll be very sore for a month." "That's manageable," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She tore more strips from the underskirt and repackaged the wound, tighter this time, tied off at his side. He sat upright through it, without being asked. His jaw was set hard against the pain, but his hands stayed still. By this point, her dress was considerably reduced. The heavy wool skirt was largely gone, replaced by a ragged hem that sat above her knees. The petticoats underneath were in strips, most of them now serving as bandaging. What remained was functional, in the sense that it covered her, but decorative, in absolutely no sense at all. She looked down at herself. Then she looked at the bandages. Good trade, she decided. The cellar was getting warm. It had been cool when they first came down, the natural temperature of deep earth. But 2 bodies generating heat in an 8x5 space, with a kerosene lamp burning, and a storm sealing every gap above the temperature, had been climbing for an hour and was still going. She pushed her sleeves up. It didn't help much. Wyatt looked at her. His color was better than it had been, which was a relief. "Talk to me," he said. "About something else. What do you want to hear about?" "Anything," he said. "Where you grew up. What you thought Arizona was going to look like." She almost laughed. "I thought it would look like the paintings." "What paintings?" "The ones in books. Very romantic. Golden light on red canyons, noble horses, dramatic clouds." She looked at the root cellar ceiling. Nobody painted the heat. Nobody painted the dust. The stagecoach smelled like 6 people, and a sheep that someone had evidently brought along for part of the journey. He made a sound that was recognizably a laugh, abbreviated by the pain in his side. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." He leaned his head back against the cellar wall. "That's the most accurate description of stagecoach travel I've heard." She looked at him. In the lamplight, the hard angles of his face were softened slightly. Not soft, just less severe. She could see the exhaustion in him and the pain he was managing with considerable discipline, and underneath both of those things, the steadiness that had been there from the first moment she'd seen him step out of the shadows in that saloon. "Tell me something in return," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to know?" She had been thinking about his back since the evening by the bunkhouse pump. 3 weeks of thinking about it, precisely, and not asking. She asked now, not because the setting was dramatic, because they were sealed in a box underground, with nowhere to be, and she was tired of carrying the question around. "Your scars," she said. "Your back." He didn't stiffen. He didn't look away. He was quiet for a few seconds, which she had learned meant he was deciding how to answer. Not whether to. "My father," he said, "started when I was about 10, went on until I was big enough that it stopped being a safe thing for him to try." She sat with that, not rushing past, not filling the space with sympathy he hadn't asked for. "How old were you then?" she said, "when it stopped?" 15, he said. "I was always big." She nodded once. "After that I left," he said. "Worked cattle drives until I had enough money to buy land. Took about 6 years." He paused. "The canyon was cheap because nobody else wanted it. Too isolated. I wanted isolated." She understood that completely. The logic of building a wall between yourself and the thing that hurt you. She had done the same thing. Differently propriety. Composure, careful stillness. Different walls, same impulse. "Does it?" she started. "No," he said. Not dismissively. Just directly. Not anymore. For a long time, it did. He looked at the lamp. "Working this land helped. Gave me something that was mine. Something I built instead of something done to me." She thought about the east half of the ranch with her name on the deed. Sitting in the county records office in Wyatt Coulter's handwriting, he had known exactly what he was giving her. Not just property. A thing that was hers. Something she built toward, instead of something that happened to her. She had understood it intellectually when they signed the agreement. She understood it differently now, sitting in a sealed root cellar, with a man who had learned that lesson the long, hard way and applied it to someone else without being asked. The lamp needed trimming. She adjusted the wick, preserving the oil. It burned lower but steadier. The heat had continued to build. The temperature in the cellar was significantly higher than it had been an hour ago. She had her sleeves pushed up as far as they'd go. Her hair, which had started the day pinned, was half down, stuck to the back of her neck. Wyatt's shirt was open at the collar. The fabric darkened with sweat, and at the side with old blood. He was sitting upright, but she could see the effort it cost him. She shifted to sit closer. Not for any reason she articulated, just that the distance between them no longer made practical sense. And she was past performing propriety in a sealed root cellar in the desert. He looked at her when she moved. She looked back. "You should rest," she said. "Sleep if you can. I'll keep watch on the wound." "I'm not sure I can sleep," he said. "Try." He tilted his head back against the wall. She stayed beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off him, which in this temperature was considerable. Close enough to see his chest rise and fall. She counted breaths for a while. They steadied out. The lamp burned. The storm pressed down. The root cellar held. She sat in the amber heat and thought about how she had arrived in this territory 3 weeks ago, with nothing but her mother's rules and a stranger's promises. And the rules had proven useless and the promises had been outright lies. And she was still here, still thinking, still deciding, still moving toward the next thing. Wyatt Coulter had not saved her. He had stood between her and a crowd of men long enough for her to regroup, and then He had handed her a gun and taught her to use it. And then he had signed half his land over to her, without ceremony, and when she had walked into that first fight in the house tonight, she had fired her own weapon and made her own decisions, and he had called her location and trusted her to hold it. She had not survived these 3 weeks because someone saved her. She had survived them because she had kept making choices, one after the other, even when she was frightened, even when the ground kept shifting. That was, she thought, what freedom actually looked like from the inside. Less triumphant than she'd imagined. More like work. The storm finally eased sometime in what she estimated was the small hours. The vibration in the earth changed, tapered, went quiet. She had almost dozed when Wyatt stirred. He was awake, looking at the ceiling. More color in his face. Better. She reached over and pressed her hand to his forehead out of reflex. No fever. Good. He looked at her hand on his forehead, then at her. She left it there for a moment, then took it back. How do you feel? She said. Like I got shot, he said. Accurate. She checked the bandaging. It's holding. You haven't bled through. He looked at the cellar door above them. Storm's gone. Yes, we should try the door. We should, she said. In a minute. He looked at her. The lamp was very low now, the flame small and wavering. In an hour it would be out. In this light, in this heat, in this stripped-down version of everything, she looked at Wyatt Coulter's face and thought about what she actually knew about him, which was a great deal for 3 weeks' acquaintance. And she thought about what she felt when she thought about it. It was not what she'd been told love was supposed to feel like. Her mother's version of love was decorative and occurred largely in parlors. The novels she'd read in secret involved a great deal of fainting and very little useful information. What she felt was nothing like that. It was more like recognition, like working alongside someone in a field and realizing partway through the day that the work is going better than it ever did alone, and looking over and understanding why. She respected him. She trusted him. She had stood back to back with him in a gunfight, and neither of them had hesitated. That was worth more than a parlor. Minute's up, Wyatt said quietly. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I suppose it is. They got the door open together, pushing up through the shifted stone with both sets of hands, and the night air came down into the cellar, cool and clean after the storm, smelling of wet desert and turned earth. Above them, Red Rock Canyon had been scoured clean. They didn't get the door fully open that night. The stone that had fallen across it was a section of the porch foundation, solid sandstone, 2 feet thick, heavier than both of them could move, from below with Wyatt, at half strength. They got it, shifted just enough to crack the door an inch, and the night air came through in a thin, cold stream, and that was enough for now. Enough to breathe, enough to know the storm was over. Wyatt sat back down against the wall and didn't argue about it, which told Tess more about his actual condition than anything he would have said directly. She trimmed the lamp wick one more time. A little oil left. Another hour, maybe. They were quiet for a while. The cellar was still warm from the hours of built-up heat, though the crack in the door was slowly pulling cooler air in along the floor. The lamp threw its small amber light. The storm's passing had left the world outside completely silent. No wind, no coyotes. Nothing. The kind of silence that only exists after something enormous has finished moving through. Tess sat close to Wyatt. Their shoulders were touching. She had stopped keeping track of when that had happened. She was aware of him in a way that was no longer casual. She had been aware of him physically. From the beginning, it would have been difficult not to be. He occupied a considerable amount of any space he entered, but that was different from this. That had been simple observation. This was something with weight to it. She had spent 3 weeks in careful proximity to a man who maintained 5 paces of deliberate distance and kept every implicit promise with the consistency of a natural law. She had watched him choose restraint so many times that the restraint had become its own form of communication. She trusted it. She trusted him. The lamplight moved with some small draft. Wyatt looked at her in it. His eyes were dark and fully alert now, the earlier fog of blood loss gone. The pain was still there, she could see it in the set of his mouth, but he was present and steady. She was aware of the heat between them. It wasn't the cellar's ambient warmth, though that was real enough. It was something more specific than that. The accumulated heat of proximity, of 3 weeks of careful distance now closed. She looked at him directly. She had spent 21 years in a world that had very specific ideas about what she was supposed to want and how she was supposed to behave and what a respectable woman did with her own body. She had been taught to sit still and take up less space and wait for someone else to decide things. She had shot a man tonight. She had kept another man alive in a hole in the ground through applied pressure and whiskey and sheer determination. She had made every decision tonight that was worth making. She could make this one too. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly, not from fear, from the particular intensity of knowing exactly what you want and deciding to reach for it anyway. She looked straight into Wyatt's dark eyes. Then she gripped the hem of her torn dress, what remained of it, and lifted it high past her hips, her bare legs visible in the amber lamplight. She shifted forward and pressed her chest against her hot breath brushing his throat. "I feel a heat," she said, and the words came out low, and something in her voice was utterly unguarded, raw with a longing she hadn't let herself name until right now. He went very still. Not the stillness of discomfort, the stillness of someone absorbing something enormous and taking it seriously. Tess. His voice was rough. His large hands came up to her hips and braced there, light as he could make them given how large his hands were. He held on and held back both at once. "Are you sure? This is your body, your choice." She looked at his face. He was asking because he needed to know, not as a formality, not as performance. He was asking because the answer genuinely determined what happened next, and he would hold his position until he had it. That was the moment she was absolutely certain. Not before it, in it. She answered him by pulling him into a kiss. He came into it slowly at first, careful of his wound and careful of her, the way he was careful of everything, methodical, attentive, reading what she gave him and responding to it, rather than overriding it. And then, as she pressed into him with her full weight and her hands in his hair and her mouth telling him plainly what she wanted, the careful part gave way to something less restrained. His hands on her hips were large and calloused and extraordinarily gentle. That combination, the sheer physical size of him and the deliberate tenderness with which he used it, was something she had no previous experience with and no frame of reference for. He moved with her and waited for her and let her set the terms of everything. She had been taught that her body was something to manage, to cover, to contain, to apologize for. That the physical world was something polite people minimized. In that cramped root cellar, in the last of the lamplight, with the desert silent above them, and the night coming in cool through the cracked door, she learned something entirely different. Her body was not a problem to solve. It was hers. It had always been hers, and given to someone who understood that fully. It was, she discovered, capable of a remarkable amount of joy. He was with her through every moment of it, present and unhurried and focused entirely on her in a way that left no room for shame or fear or any of the voices she'd been carrying all her life. The voices that said less and smaller and quiet and wait. She was not quiet. She did not wait. Afterward, she lay against his left side, carefully avoiding his wound, her head on his chest. His arm was around her, heavy and warm. His heartbeat under her ear was steady, a little faster than usual. The lamp had gone out. The cellar was dark, except for the line of pale pre-dawn light coming through the crack in the door above. She thought about what she'd felt. Not the physical particulars, though those were significant. The other thing, the thing underneath. She did not love Wyatt Coulter because he had stepped between her and a crowd of men in a saloon. She did not love him because he was large and capable and good with a rifle. Those were facts about him, and she was glad of them. but they were not the reason. She loved him because he had handed her a gun on the second day and said, "This is so you can defend yourself without depending on someone else being present." Because he had put her name on a land deed without being asked. Because he had asked her, "Are you sure?" in a root cellar while bleeding, and meant it and waited for the answer. He had never once treated her freedom as a gift he was giving her. He had treated it as a thing she already possessed that simply needed the right conditions to exercise. That was different. That was worth everything. "Hey," Wyatt said, his voice low in the dark. "Yes," she said. "You all right?" She considered the question honestly. She was in a sealed root cellar in the Arizona desert. Her dress was largely destroyed. She was married to a man she'd known for 3 weeks. There was a criminal gang somewhere, out in the territory, and a gold shipment coming through the county, and a man named Harlan Finch, who had used her as a chess piece and would likely do so again given the chance. She was also, she noticed, entirely unfrightened. For the first time since the stagecoach stopped in Dusted Creek, and everything went sideways, there was no undercurrent of fear running beneath everything else. She was alert. She was thinking. She was aware of the problems ahead, but not afraid. "Yes," she said. "I'm quite all right." His hand moved slowly along her arm, a simple and uncalculated gesture. She felt his breathing settle. "We'll get the door open at first light," he said. "We will," she agreed. "Finch will have pulled back during the storm. His men won't regroup fast." "Probably not," she said. "We'll have time to get to the sheriff." "And the telegraph," he said. "Need to get word to the county marshal about the shipment." She had her notebook in her head, every observation and date and careful phrase from those letters. She would write it all out when they got upstairs, and it would be clear and organized and useful. She was already thinking about next steps. She was already planning. She had not arrived in Arizona as a planner. She had arrived as someone following someone else's plan, which had promptly collapsed. She had built her own, out here, one decision at a time, on ground she had learned to stand on. The pre-dawn light through the crack in the door grew gradually from gray to pale gold. Wyatt's breathing deepened. She let him sleep. She stayed awake and watched the light change and thought through everything that needed to happen next. Clear-headed and steady, while the desert outside the root cellar came back to life one bird at a time. When the light was strong enough, she woke him gently. "Ready?" she said. He opened his eyes, looked at her. "Ready," he said. They pushed the door open together. They got the door open at first light. Tess pushed from below while Wyatt braced his good side against the stone and shoved. The sandstone shifted grudgingly, inch by inch, and then the whole slab gave way with a grinding scrape, and the morning air fell down into the cellar like a gift. She climbed out first and stood in the ruins of the porch. The ranch looked like a different place. The storm had scoured everything. The garden was half buried. One wall of the barn had a hole in it, the size of a wagon wheel. The vegetable beds were gone entirely. Just flat red earth now, where the bean rows had been. The water trough had been knocked onto its side. But the house was standing. The barn was standing. Milton was in his stall, unhappy and hungry, but whole. Wyatt came up out of the cellar slowly. She gave him her arm without making a thing of it. He took it without making a thing of it either. He straightened up and looked around at the damage with the expression of a man doing math. "Fixable," he said. "Most of it," she agreed. They found 2 of Finch's men on the property. Both of them were gone before daylight, tracks heading south. The man she'd shot through the back door had left a blood trail that went 30 yards into the scrub and then picked up horse tracks. He had made it out on his own. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Mostly, she felt practical about it. They fed Milton. They ate what was in the cellar, which was shelf-stable and not exciting. Wyatt changed the bandaging on his side and didn't make noise about it. And Tess tied it off tight and told him he was not going to be doing anything strenuous for 2 weeks. And he said, "We'll see." And she said, "No, we won't." And that was more or less the end of that discussion. They rode into town 3 days later, when Wyatt could stay upright in the saddle without going gray around the mouth. The county circuit court sat in session twice a month in the largest building in Dusted Creek, which was also, on alternate weeks, a feed storage facility. The smell of grain never fully left the walls. Judge Orrin Pell presided. He was 60 years old, built like a chimney, and had a reputation for impatience with theatrics and patience with facts. Harlan Finch had been apprehended near the border 4 days after the haboob by a deputy marshal acting on the telegraph Wyatt had sent from town. He had been found with 2 of his remaining men, a mule loaded with stolen ammunition, and a hand-drawn map of the county gold shipment route with notations in his own handwriting. He was currently in the county jail, and his attorney, who had ridden up from Tucson, was presenting the case that his original marriage contract with Tess was legally binding, and that the subsequent marriage to Wyatt Coulter was therefore fraudulent. The attorney was smooth. He had a good suit and a way of speaking that made complicated things sound simple and simple things sound complicated. He used the word property 3 times in his opening remarks, each time in reference to Tess. He called the original contract a binding instrument of transfer. Tess sat in the front row and listened, and kept her face still. When the attorney finished, Judge Pell looked over his spectacles at the room. He was about to speak when Tess stood up. Cray, sitting beside her, made a small sound of surprise. Wyatt, on her other side, did not. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to address the court." Pell looked at her for a long moment. He was not a man who made decisions quickly. He made them correctly. "You may," he said. She walked to the front of the room. Finch was in the defendant's area to her left, and she looked at him directly when she turned around. He looked back at her with a smile that was mostly habit. He still thought he was the most capable person in any room he entered. She supposed that was what happened when you were clever enough to fool most people for most of your life. You stopped accounting for the exceptions. She looked away from him. She looked at the judge and the room full of townspeople behind her, the miners and the shopkeepers, and the women from the edge of town who had come to see what this was. She took a breath. Laws were created to protect human beings, she said, not to legalize possession. A piece of paper signed back east does not give anyone the right to buy or sell my dignity. I am a free woman, and my choice is to stand alongside a man who sees me as an equal partner. Nobody moved. She had more to say, and she said it. She laid out the argument plainly. A contract required the willing participation of both parties. She had been presented with a correspondence that misrepresented the man sending it and the life he was offering. She had been brought to a territory under false pretenses, abandoned, threatened, and then targeted by the same man who had abandoned her, using forged stories about her own captivity as a tool to further his criminal objectives. Harlan Finch had not sought to enforce any marriage contract in the months she'd been in Arizona. He had sought to use her existence as leverage against people who stood in his way. This court has before it a man who has stolen from this town, she said, who conspired to rob a county gold shipment, who left a woman he claimed to be engaged to as a debt token in a saloon, and who then tried to have that same woman removed from legal protection by manufacturing a mob. His claim on my person is not a legal matter. It is an extension of the same pattern. He wants something. He is using the language of law to try to take it. She looked at Pell. I have not asked to be protected. I have asked to be left alone. I am asking this court to recognize the difference between a legal instrument and an instrument of control, and to rule accordingly. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Pell called for order twice before he got it. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and then looked at Finch's attorney, who had the expression of a man who had prepared for several versions of this proceeding, and this had not been one of them. Counsel, the judge said, the court is not inclined to recognize a pre-existing contract as superseding a legally witnessed marriage performed in this county, particularly given the substantial evidence of fraudulent misrepresentation by your client throughout the correspondence in question. The original contract, insofar as it can be said to have existed at all, was built on deception from the moment it was initiated. He looked at Finch. The criminal charges will be addressed separately and at length. As to the matter of the marriage contract, that claim is denied. Finch's smile, the one that had barely moved during her speech, finally shifted. Not much, just enough for her to see. She had seen enough of him. She looked away. Outside the courthouse in the afternoon heat, Wyatt stood next to her on the steps while the crowd dispersed around them. "You didn't need me in there at all," he said. "I needed you to be standing," she said. That was enough. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. His hand found hers briefly, and she held it for a moment, and then they walked down the steps together toward where Milton was tied. That was when the shot rang out. Not from the street. From the alley, beside the general store, 30 feet away. One of Finch's men, the last one unaccounted for, had been waiting. Wyatt moved. Tess moved. They went different directions, which was correct, which was what they had talked about. The second shot went wide. Wyatt crossed the distance between himself and the gunman with about 4 steps, which should not have been physically possible for a man with a bullet wound less than a week old. He caught the man's gun arm at the wrist before the third shot could go off and twisted. The gun hit the dirt. Then Wyatt's elbow caught the man across the jaw, and that was more or less that. The man went down. He stayed down. Wyatt stood over him, breathing hard. A dark spot was spreading at his right side. He had torn something. Tess was already moving toward him. "I told you," she said, 2 weeks. "Closer to 1, he said. That was not a negotiation. He looked down at the man on the ground, then called to Cray, who had come out of the courthouse at a run. "Sheriff, you've got one more." Cray looked at the man on the ground. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at the growing stain on Wyatt's shirt. "You need a doctor," Cray said. "He knows," Tess said. "He's just finishing a sentence first." Wyatt looked at the people gathered in the street. There were a dozen of them now, spilled out from the courthouse, watching. He looked at the man on the ground, who was conscious again, and sitting up, looking at his own wrist. "This territory has seen too much blood spilled over blind vengeance," Wyatt said, and he said it to the crowd as much as to anyone specific. "If we don't respect the law in human life, we're no better than the barren rocks out in the desert." He handed the man's gun to Cray, grip first. Then he let Tess steer him toward the doctor's office. The doctor's name was Beaumont. He was 70, mostly deaf in one ear, and did not believe in unnecessary conversation during medical procedures, which Wyatt appreciated. Tess sat in the waiting room and listened to the quiet from behind the closed door and did not let herself be frightened. Wyatt had torn the external stitching, not the underlying repair. Beaumont had said so before he closed the door. The wound was not reopened in any way that mattered. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the next several months instead. The ranch needed significant work. The garden had to be replanted if they were going to have any winter stores. The barn wall. The porch. She had ideas about the east pasture fence line that she'd been sketching in her notebook. The stream ran clear year-round, which meant irrigation was possible if they dug a secondary channel. Finch's trial would take another few weeks to complete formally. She would need to testify again. Probably. She was prepared for that. When Beaumont let her in, Wyatt was sitting up on the examination table, looking irritated in the specific way he looked when he was being made to stay still. 2 weeks, Beaumont said, pointing one emphatic finger at him. "No lifting, no riding hard, no getting shot." "I'll pass that along," Tess said. Wyatt looked at her. "He's talking to me." "I know." She helped him off the table, and he accepted it without comment, which was its own kind of communication. They stayed in town 2 more days. Cray had a spare room above the sheriff's office that he offered without ceremony, and they took it, and Tess spent the time writing out her full account of everything she knew about Finch's operation. Every letter, every phrase, every date. She wrote it out in organized sections, and gave it to the county marshal, who had ridden up from the south, and he read it with the careful attention of someone who recognized solid documentation when he saw it. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her. "The profession wasn't open to me," she said pleasantly. He looked at her for a moment. "No, I suppose not. Might be something to consider changing," she said. He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't expect him to. But she'd said it out loud, in front of a county official, and it existed now as a thing that had been said. On the second afternoon, she walked to the county records office and asked to see the deed on the east half of the Coulter Ranch. The clerk, a young man with ink on his fingers and a startled expression, pulled it out and confirmed it was filed correctly in her name, Tess Montgomery Coulter. She looked at it. The handwriting was Wyatt's, from when he'd filled out the transfer paperwork. She thanked the clerk and walked back out into the afternoon sun. Harlan Finch's sentencing came the following week, after they'd returned to the ranch. Cray rode out to tell them. Finch received 7 years of hard labor for the robbery of the town's ammunition supply, conspiracy to commit robbery of a federal gold shipment, and criminal fraud in connection with the original correspondence and marriage contract. His 2 remaining men received shorter terms. The map with the gold shipment notations had been particularly useful. The county marshal had arranged for a decoy shipment and caught 2 more men Finch had paid in advance, waiting at the planned ambush point, with no ambush to spring. Tess wrote all of this in her notebook, not because she needed the record anymore, but because it felt right to close the account properly. The ranch work was steadying in those weeks. She and Wyatt rebuilt the porch wall together, him directing from a seated position for the first week, and then, once he was cleared to move properly, working alongside her. She had gotten stronger, not in a dramatic way, just the practical way that comes from 3 months of actual physical work. She could lift things she couldn't have lifted in Philadelphia. She could ride for 3 hours without her legs aching afterward. She replanted the garden from seeds she bought in town, adding rows of things she actually wanted rather than just what had been there before. Tomatoes, squash, an ambitious attempt at peppers that the woman at the general store told her were tricky in this soil. "Worth trying," Tess said. The woman looked at her with an expression that suggested she agreed about more than just the peppers. On a Thursday morning, about a month after the trial, Tess was at the table with her notebook, when Wyatt came in from the morning chores and sat down across from her with coffee and the look of someone who has been thinking about something. She waited. "I've been thinking about the south pasture," he said. "It's been empty since I bought the land. Good grass when the rain's right. I've been running too few cattle for the size of the operation." "You've been running the ranch alone," she said. "Yeah." He looked at his coffee. "I'm not anymore." She sat with that for a moment. It was simply said and exactly true. "What are you thinking for numbers?" she said. They spent the next hour talking cattle and grass and water and winter feed costs, and she took notes and he revised them, and they argued productively about the second fence line and reached a compromise that was better than either of their original positions. That was the shape of things now. Not a rescue, not a transaction. A partnership built from the working end, the way most real things got built. Outside, the canyon walls caught the morning light and held it, deep red going gold. The stream ran. The horses moved in the corral. The garden had new green shoots coming up in the bean rows. Tess looked at what she had written in her notebook. Plans, notes, schedules. Her handwriting beside his in the margins of the deed paperwork in the county records office. Her name on the land. She thought about the girl who had gotten off a stagecoach 3 months ago in a strange town with $11 and a silver hairbrush and a stranger's promises. That girl had been frightened and proud and stubborn and alone. She did not regret any of those things. They had gotten her through the first hour, and the first hour had led to everything else. What she had now was not what she had come to Arizona to find. It was considerably better than that. 6 months later, the ranch was loud in the mornings. Not loud the way a city was loud, loud the way a working place gets when there are people in it. Voices from the direction of the new schoolroom. The sound of children, which Tess had not expected to be something she'd associate with the canyon, and now couldn't imagine without. The schoolroom had been her idea in October, when the rains came, and the nights got cold, and she found herself with evenings that needed filling in a direction she hadn't yet gone. It had started as a conversation with two women from the edge of town who came out to buy eggs. Both of them had children who were not in school because the town's one-room schoolhouse only ran through the spring, and the teacher had left in July. Tess had a table and a stove and a considerable amount of accumulated education she had never been permitted to do much with. She had used her own savings from before Arizona. What remained of the $12 she'd arrived with, which was admittedly not $12 after stagecoach, food, and general survival, plus what she'd earned helping Cray's wife with account keeping over the winter, and what she'd set aside from the ranch's modest cattle sales. She bought slates and chalk and a small collection of primers. She built a shelf against the south wall of the new addition. Wyatt had helped her frame out in November. She started with 5 children and 2 women who couldn't read. By February, there were 11 children and 4 women. She taught reading and basic arithmetic, and when the students were ready for it, enough practical writing to allow them to correspond, to understand a deed, to read a contract before they signed it. That last part she taught deliberately. She taught it with Harlan Finch's letters as her example. The careful phrases and deliberate ambiguities, the language designed to sound like one thing and mean another. She showed the women how to read a document twice, the second time looking for what it didn't say. A piece of paper is only as honest as the person who wrote it, she told them. Learn to read the paper and the person at the same time. A woman named Clara, who was learning to write her name for the first time at age 34, said quietly that she wished someone had told her that 20 years ago. Tess did not have an answer for that beyond. Well, you know it now. Wyatt had doubled the cattle and fixed every fence on the property and built a second water channel from the stream to the east pasture, which was everything he'd planned and had come in slightly under budget because Tess had negotiated the lumber price in town. He was working in the far pasture this morning. She could see him from the schoolroom window, a small, distant figure against the red canyon wall, moving with the unhurried competence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had nowhere else to be. She watched him for a moment and then went back to the primer she was marking. The afternoon was free after the students left. She took Milton out along the canyon trail, the one she had barely been able to follow 6 months ago and could now ride in the dark, if she had to. The canyon was different in the spring. Green at the base, along the stream. Wildflowers in the rock crevices. A pair of hawks had nested on the south ridge and were visible most mornings, circling. She thought about what she'd come here expecting and what she'd found instead. She had expected someone to take care of her. That had been the deal, the understood arrangement, the thing the letters had promised between the lines. A woman of her situation and her time married, because the world was structured to make being alone nearly impossible and being dependent nearly inevitable. She had not found someone to take care of her. She had found ground to stand on, which was different. The standing she'd had to do herself. She had done it. She had surprised herself more than anyone. When she came back in along the canyon trail, Wyatt was at the fence near the barn, checking the new post line. He heard Milton's hooves and looked up. He waited until she'd dismounted and walked toward him, then fell into step with her. They walked to the porch without speaking, sat down on the bench she'd built in January, which was slightly uneven but structurally sound. The canyon caught the late afternoon light the way it always did, that particular warm red that didn't exist anywhere else she had ever been. The hawks were up on their thermal. The stream was audible from here, low and constant. She leaned back against the post and let herself simply sit in it for a minute. She thought about Philadelphia and her mother's parlor and the correct way to pour tea and the 11 rules about how to sit in a chair in mixed company. She thought about them with something that was not quite nostalgia and not quite contempt. Something more like the way you think about a coat you wore for a long time that you finally took off because you'd come somewhere warm. School went well today, she said. Yeah? He was looking out at the canyon, the addition, holding up. Fine. The south wall seals better than the north. We might need to caulk the north window before next winter. I'll get to it. I know you will. A comfortable quiet. This was one of the things she had learned she loved about him. The quiet didn't require filling. Saw Cray in town this morning, he said. Finch appealed. He would, she said. He'll lose. Probably. Definitely, she said. The documentary record is solid. I gave the marshal everything he needed. Wyatt almost smiled. She knew that expression now. The precise configuration of his face that indicated amusement he wasn't going to perform. She almost smiled back for the same reasons. The evening was coming in slowly, the way it did in the canyon. The light dropping from the top of the walls first, and leaving the bottom in warm shadow while the sky above stayed lit. It was one of the things about this place she had not anticipated and could not have imagined in advance. The way the light moved here was specific to Red Rock Canyon, to the angle of these particular walls, to this particular stream and this particular bend in the rock. It was hers. Half legally, all practically, she had worked every foot of it. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago in that saloon, holding her collar with one hand and standing straight and telling a roomful of men that she was not a gold coin to be traded for someone else's debt. She had not been wrong then. She had known it in the moment, and she knew it better now. You could be frightened and still be right. You could be new to a place and still know what you were worth. That wasn't courage in the dramatic sense. That was just refusing to let fear do your thinking for you. She had brought that to Arizona, and she had kept it the whole time, and she was not finished with it yet. The schoolroom needed a second shelf. She was writing to a woman in Tucson who ran a small lending library, working out an arrangement to borrow primers and rotate them through her students. She had written 3 letters to the county about establishing a permanent teacher's stipend for rural schools, and the 3rd letter had received a response that was non-committal in a way that meant they were thinking about it. She would write a 4th letter, and a 5th if necessary. She was not in a hurry. She was in Arizona. She had land and a garden and a schoolroom and a man beside her who had never once suggested she be quieter or smaller or more convenient, and the sky out here at night was still the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen. And the peppers had actually come up in the spring, which the woman at the general store had been wrong about. Wyatt wrapped his arms around her from behind, his large hands resting gently on her waist. He was warm from the afternoon work and solid, and she leaned back into him without ceremony. The sun found the last of the canyon rim and held there, golden and absolute. She was not the frightened girl from the stagecoach anymore. She was not a bride abandoned in a saloon. She was not a debt token, or a chess piece, or a piece of property, or a possession to be managed. She was Tess Montgomery Coulter. She owned the east half of a working ranch in Red Rock Canyon, Arizona. She ran a school on Friday mornings and negotiated lumber prices and could put 4 rounds in a fence post at 50 feet and had once kept a man alive in a hole in the ground with strips of her own dress and a bottle of whiskey. She was fully, completely, entirely herself. The sun went below the rim. The canyon filled with its particular dusk, that moment between gold and purple when the air seemed to hold its breath. Good day, Wyatt said quietly, against her hair. She looked out at the canyon, hers and his, built and held and worked and kept. Yes, she said it was. Tess Montgomery didn't arrive in Arizona looking for freedom. She arrived looking for a husband, a roof, a plan that someone else had made for her, because that was the only kind of plan the world had ever offered her. The plan collapsed within an hour of the stagecoach stopping. And that right there is where the real story begins. Not the romance, not the gunfights, not the man who stepped out of the shadows when nobody else would. The real story is what Tess did after everything she'd been promised turned out to be a lie. She didn't collapse. She didn't wait to be rescued. She stood in a saloon full of hostile men with $11 to her name and said, out loud, to anyone who would listen, "I am a human being, not a piece of property." And she meant every word. That moment didn't save her. She saved herself, one decision at a time, every single day after that. She learned to shoot. She learned to ride. She read the letters nobody told her to read and figured out a conspiracy that the sheriff had missed entirely. She held a wounded man alive in a hole in the ground with strips of her own dress and sheer refusal to quit. And when she stood in that courtroom and spoke to the judge, she wasn't asking for protection. She was demanding recognition of something she already knew to be true, that a contract built on deception is not a contract at all, and that no piece of paper, no matter where it was signed or who signed it, gives one human being ownership over another. That's the thing this story is actually about. Not the cowboy, not the kiss, not even the canyon, as beautiful as it is. It's about what happens when a person stops waiting for permission to take up space. Tess came from a world that had spent 21 years telling her to be smaller, quieter, more convenient, more grateful, more careful. She brought all of that with her on the stagecoach. And then, piece by piece, circumstance by circumstance, she set it down. Not in one dramatic moment, in dozens of ordinary ones. A trigger squeezed instead of pulled, a fence post repaired, a contract drafted at a kitchen table, a notebook filled with careful, organized observations that eventually put a criminal in prison. Freedom, this story argues, is not something you're given. It's something you practice. You practice it when you're frightened. You practice it when the ground is unstable and the future is unclear, and the people around you haven't caught up yet to the idea that you're allowed to make your own choices. You practice it especially then. And Wyatt Coulter is not the hero of this story in the traditional sense. He doesn't rescue Tess. He doesn't complete her. What he does, and this is rarer than it sounds, is refuse to treat her freedom as something he controls. He hands her a weapon on day 2. He puts her name on a land deed. He asks, "Are you sure?" in a root cellar while bleeding, and he waits for the actual answer. He has his own wounds, his own walls, his own hard history. But he never uses any of that as a reason to diminish someone else. He builds instead of takes. He respects instead of possesses. And he understands, in the bone-deep way that only comes from hard experience, that the worst prison on earth is coercion, and that a partnership worth having is one where both people can walk away and choose every day to stay. That's what Tess chooses in the end. Not safety, not rescue. A partner who sees her clearly and stands beside her at the same elevation. The schoolroom she builds in the final chapter is not an epilogue detail. It's the whole point. She takes everything she learned about reading contracts carefully, about knowing your rights, about the difference between a legal instrument and an instrument of control, and she teaches it to women who never had access to any of it. She turns her own survival into someone else's starting point. That is what it looks like when a person doesn't just claim their own freedom, but actively works to extend it to others. That's the story. That's what it's for. Whatever brought you here tonight, whether you came for the romance, the drama, the desert, or just something that felt alive, we hope you're leaving with something that stays with you a little longer than the last scene. You are not a gold coin to be traded for someone else's debt. You never were. This story is a work of fiction set in the American West during the 19th century. All characters, events, locations, and dialogue are entirely fictional and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. The story contains depictions of historical social conditions, including limited rights for women, which are presented critically and not endorsed. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This content is intended for mature audiences. Viewer and reader discretion is advised.